Ready? Good morning. I'm John Jacob McAvoy, Family Curator for Photography at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's forum, Irving Penn at the Intersection of Art, Fashion, and Photography. From the perspective of art history, the invention of photography is a relatively recent occurrence, and the appearance of photography curators more recent still. The Smithsonian Institution has played a key role in that history as among the earliest American institutions to collect and exhibit photography. At the Smithsonian, Mary Foresta played a key role in shaping those collections and exhibitions. She joined the American Art Museum in 1977, was named its first Curator of Photography in 1983, and later served as Senior Curator of Photography for the Smithsonian's International Art Museums Division. From 2000 to 2010, she was founding director of the Smithsonian Photography Initiative. At the American Art Museum, Mary expanded the photography collection with key examples of American vernacular photography, most notably the Charles Isaacs collection acquired in 1994. Mary's approach to the fine art through vernacular photography was unheard of at the time, and the strength of her vision for the collection distinguishes it to this day. Mary also organized important survey exhibitions by important major artists, including Man Ray and Irving Penn. Penn's career in particular was one of crossed rather than secured boundaries, making his work difficult to pin down. In Irving Penn Beyond Beauty, she has revisited and expanded upon an earlier exhibition, Irving Penn Master Images, which the American Art Museum and the National Portrait Gallery undertook in 1990. 25 years later, Penn's work continues to amaze. 6 years after his death, however, it's only now that we're able to assess its full scope. From fashion and advertising to portraiture and still life to purely visual concerns. What will we discover about Irving Penn at the intersection of art, photography, and fashion? To set the stage for that conversation, I'm pleased to introduce Mary Foresta, guest curator of Beyond Beauty and moderator of this forum.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being interested in Irving Penn and coming out on this beautiful Friday morning in the fall. And thank you, John, for that beautiful introduction. I know he will be a worthy successor in the curatorial departments of the American Art Museum, and I say that not even because he said so many nice things about me. Before I start, it is important that I thank one more time the museum for putting on this extraordinary exhibition, all the bits and pieces of it that come together so beautifully. Here is always an amazing thing to see, and I think the exhibition shows the care with which the museum worked to make that happen. And of course, the Irving Penn Foundation, who made two extraordinary gifts to this museum and the Smithsonian, the first in 1990, and the second more recently, which allowed us to put on such a full retrospective of Irving Penn. It has been a joy working with the Penn Foundation, and they have definitely opened their doors and opened the boxes, and it's just been an extraordinary experience as a curator. And as John said, to revisit material that you saw 25 years ago and thought about 25 years ago and realize how much increased thinking there has been about photography of all kinds in 25 years, and how much personally I can say that I've grown in 25 years, to be able to think about it is a wonderful opportunity. To begin today, I'd like to do something that honors something that some of you may have noticed about Irving Penn. And in many of his photographs, he's a little perverse. He likes to put mannequins in blocks of ice and crack the ice. He, in a still life of beautiful objects and beautiful foods laid out on a beautifully clothed table, he'll put a bug on the flour sack. Or he will show us a portrait of a beautiful woman wearing a beautiful dress in a bare corner with lots of threads on the floor. So today, I'd like to begin by thinking about Irving Penn from the beginning, the very earliest Penns, and though we are here to talk about the intersection of art photography and a magazine culture, I thought I'd start with many of the images that were never before published by Irving Penn. First, though, I might say that today we have brought together a number of people who knew Penn and worked with Penn and wrote about Penn. Throughout his long career, Penn walked the line between editorial, fine art, and commercial photography, probably like no one else before him. Today, it's no novelty to be working simultaneously as an artist and as a magazine or advertising photographer. Penn could be said to have opened that space and make all of that possible. We know, in large part thanks to Penn, that art has its own sense of fashion. The art world establishes new reputations with a frequency some find amazing, and the art press collaborates with galleries and museums in erecting platforms to place new talent and chart new aesthetic directions. Artists as celebrities now cultivate their public personas with careful attention to what they wear and what fashionable parties they attend. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the most popular press event of the year is the annual benefit for the Costume Institute, the museum's fashion collection. We might conclude, and hopefully will be given greater evidence for a conclusion from the speakers today, that the various realms of fine art, style, function, instrumentality, realism, abstraction, and perhaps above all visual culture are adaptation to a world awash in images that have occupied the discussion of photography in our time have all been invoked in assessing the achievements of Penn's photography. From the beginning, Penn I'm not sure which one to push here. Nope, not that one. Can someone up there adjust this? What have I done wrong? From the beginning, Penn, by circumstance or deliberate endeavor, juggled the various contexts of fashion, art, and photography. And as I said, I will begin with work that very few people have seen. It was all a design. It was all a design. In 1990, I had just completed work on an exhibition of his work that coincided with his first gift to the American Art Museum. Thank you. Do you want to stay with me? This time, a set of 60 platinum palladium prints that represented many of the most iconic works of his career were shown. Visiting Penn in his studio, and at the end of a long afternoon visit, Penn paused and said to me, "You might be interested in seeing these." By this point in his life and career, and at that point he had been working for over 50 years, there was probably a great deal to see that could have been interesting. By then, Penn had been making images for over half a century, and his reputation was secure. His career, as prolific as it was successful, had crossed the divide between commerce and art with astounding ease. His pictures were published in the pages of glossy magazines, and mass audiences saw them exhibited in prestigious galleries and museums. Many of them made appearances in both venues. His expertise in the darkroom, especially his investigation with platinum printing, rendered photographs that demonstrate his commitment to both beauty and perfection. But what are we to make of these? On that afternoon 25 years ago, he took several binders of images off the shelf, and he showed me page after page after page of his earliest photographs, work he had made in the late 1930s on the streets of Philadelphia and New York. His first camera, a Rolleiflex, was purchased with money he saved while working as a summer intern for Alexei Brodovich, art director at Harper's Bazaar, and who had also been Penn's teacher at the Pennsylvania Museum School of Industrial Art. Brodovich's course would have been a real eye-opener. The school prospectus described it as a course agenda that included, I'll quote from the catalog, excursions to factories and shopping centers, as well as intimate contact with all developments in art, museums, exhibitions, lectures, theaters, and concerts. Brodovich also instilled in an eager Penn knowledge of the world of modern European, now you've all gone dark, world of modern European visual culture, sharing not only his personal experience, but also his library of art books and magazines, which offered Penn the contemporary mix of European modernism and surrealism. Penn's first images of storefronts and old buildings, photographs of advertising signs in cutout shapes, urban hieroglyphics hanging high above the doors of shops. These were photographs Penn called that day camera notes. More, he said, to remember what I saw than with serious photographic intent. These images have a whimsical matter-of-factness, yet during his urban rambles, he learned how to see photographically, and in particular what he and his handheld camera were capable of. Social documents? Of course. How could they not be in the late 1930s? But they accumulated references for a more poetic, evocative narrative. Presumably, thanks to Brodovich, some were also printed in Harper's Bazaar. It was a good beginning. The majority of the photographs he showed me that day, however, were made on a trip he made in 1941 through the American South on his way to Mexico. These were photographs of odd architecture and signs and portraits of young African-American men lounging in front of storefronts and barbershops, photographs which are part social documentary and part artistic observation. Though they may initially remind us of the South as photographed by Walker Evans, Penn, however, always said that he could not remember seeing the important Walker Evans show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1937. But in the end, they, like his early urban scenes, are more truly the offspring of the Frenchman Eugene Atget, who recorded Paris and its surroundings from the late 1890s until his death in 1927, and who was taken up and promoted by the Surrealists, especially in Surrealist magazines, ones Brodovich might have showed him while Penn served as his assistant. Penn remembered that Brodovich often would open a magazine. Perhaps it was Cahiers d'Art or the latest Minotaur brought over from France by some of Brodovich's artist friends, lay it on the table and say, "Penn, come over here and take a look at this." In hindsight, we notice his ability to pose a subject or his attention to clothes stylishly worn, or his use of the camera to capture the details of buttons and fabric patterns or gentle folds of a garment. In these images, we have a first real glimpse of the later, mature Penn. As the story goes, Penn left New York in 1941 for Mexico to paint. As a location for a year abroad, Mexico was in many ways an obvious choice. War had made Europe out of the question for an artistic destination. However, Mexico City's exotic international art community and lively cafe culture had been attracting North American artists for much of the 20th century. By the late 1930s, Mexico City, having become a haven for European intellectuals and artists, loomed large on the surrealist map of fascinating places. Penn's sudden aspiration to paint reflects a more complicated desire. He said he had a need to paint. Although he saved some drawings and watercolors, he apparently realized he was never to be a great painter. At the end of his year in Mexico, Penn brought home only washed, scraped, and rolled up canvases. However, and more importantly, his larger reason for leaving, to acquire experience, to witness new places, a different culture, or follow art, remained intact. It would remain his modus operandi throughout his career, to go away, to come back, all the while true to his own artistic impulse. Though less recognizable or recognized than classic Penn photographs, the pictures have embedded in them the elements out of which he constructed his entire career. Showing the marked influence of Surrealism, many consist of odd arrangements of things, either found or constructed. This penchant for incongruous contiguity is visible in all his work, whether in the form of odd juxtapositions, think of the signs in shop windows, or high fashion in a rough-floored studio, fashion transported to places it isn't expected, on the street, with foreign cultures, the imposed constraints of his portrait poses, the rendering of cigarette butts in the most luxurious of photographic materials, or the disconcerting sight of baby chicks stuffed in a jar. After a year in Mexico, Penn came home to New York with scraped and rolled up canvases, and most importantly, a suitcase full of negatives, and began a job at Vogue, working with Vogue's new art director, Alexander Lieberman. As he had done earlier with European magazines, Lieberman set out to modernize Vogue, changing not only the design, but also the way photography was used. Like Brodovich, Lieberman shared with Penn his knowledge of the modern European visual culture. With Penn, he found his visual compatriot for his new magazine. Penn had returned to New York an artist, albeit now a photographer who plied his art in the pages of magazines. He never forgot his aspiration to be an artist or to make a work that would be considered outside the confines of the commercial world. His genius was to do both simultaneously. And briefly, I'd like you to consider 3 classic Penn photographs. Made for a July 1st, 1947 article titled "Elements of a Party," Penn arranged a classic 17th century Dutch still life painting of luxurious objects overflowing with sumptuous foods. Rendered in velvety light that softens the folds of the fabrics and curves of the cups into a harmonious whole, the emphasis is on aesthetic appeal. Yet, Penn has not resisted an addition that suggests something else. On the nearly overflowing sack of grain, Penn has placed the spoiler of a beetle. A reminder, perhaps, that luxury, like beauty, can be fleeting. Penn began his work for Vogue as a photographer of still life. His first Vogue cover was published on the October 1st, 1943 issue. In various ways, some obvious and some subtle, Penn continued to mine the still life genre as both theme and motif, even while he satisfied a given assignment. Beyond the situational collaboration between life and art, we can also imagine the impact of both luxury and history combined only a few years after the restrictions of World War II. Penn has established a visual arena in which aesthetics, fashion, and current events could go toe-to-toe. Penn photographed Lisa Fossingrave's Penn in the Rokas mermaid dress on his first assignment to Paris to photograph the couture collections for Vogue in August 1950, published in the September 15, 1950 issue of Vogue. For Penn, Vogue borrowed the top floor of an old photography school, and a discarded theater curtain was found to use for a studio backdrop. It was an artist's atelier worthy of Delacroix. He later wrote, "The light was the light of Paris, as I had imagined it, soft but defining." Here, in this 2-week rented studio, he created some of the most spare and delicate fashion photographs yet produced, treating the clothes less as dresses to be worn than as shapes to be perceived as sculpture. His portrait of Lisa, for it is also a portrait of an individual woman, a woman that also happens to be his wife, is a photograph that makes us aware of how style operates. Penn allows a provocative, just a glimpse of the studio, its starkness suggested by bare floorboards and empty walls. The model is confined to the impractical beauty of her dress. Penn controls the space and the light. Pinning his model, she seems almost to levitate onto the shallow ground of the canvas backdrop. No feet. Penn has truly created a mermaid. Such artistic dominance jars us out of our usual immersion in the fashion pitch. And lastly, consider our Head in Ice, made in New York in 2002, published in Vogue, February 2003, as the illustration for a beauty article about the effectiveness of washing our faces in cold water. During the last 20 years of his life, Penn devoted himself increasingly to experimentation, with printing and with new subject matter. In the 1970s, he perfected the process of platinum printing, producing images of cigarette butts and street trash that to many were shocking. Who makes photographs of street trash meticulously printed using expensive metals? Even as the Museum of Modern Art and the Metropolitan Museum of Art were devoting galleries to exhibiting them. He modified cameras and became ever more free and expressive with the materials. At Vogue, where by the 1980s he had the status of elder statesman, Penn increasingly replaced his elegant style with provocative images of a more contradictory beauty. Left to his own devices and the requests of a changing magazine culture, hoping to sustain reader interest, he would smear lipstick on the mouths of models or smeared their mouths with chocolate for photographs that have captions such as, "Could something that tastes this delicious actually be good for you?" Penn was now interested in beauty in the extreme, cosmetics applied to a mannequin head and frozen in a block of ice. Here and elsewhere, he returned to a brand of surrealism he had relished in his youth. In the end, a man like Penn, very elegant, spoke mostly through his images, and he spoke little about his work in public. However, he did so on several occasions, which are worth noting on this day of symposium, because he attended two very important ones during his life. What is Modern Photography took place at the Museum of Modern Art on October 20th, 1950. Apparently, it was a significant enough event to be broadcast live on WNYC radio. MoMA curator for photography, Edward Steichen, moderated. In addition to Penn, participants included Margaret Burke-White, Walker Evans, Louis Four, John Mealy, Lisette Modell, Wright Morris, Ben Shahn, Charles Sheeler, and Aaron Siskind. Apparently, and according to the panel, one thing modern photography was destined for was the printed page. Modell working as a contributing photographer Alexei Brodovich at Harper's Bazaar. Millet worked for Life magazine, as did Margaret Burke-White. It is here that Penn notoriously spoke the line that the committed photographer worked for the printed page. He did say this, but it is in the context of another idea that was much more important. The modern photographer, he said, had a privilege of communicating as never before. Never, he said, has anyone working in the field of visual art been able to communicate so widely. The most vital record of human existence is the visual record. In Penn's mind, the modern photographer was a special form of journalist. He concluded his remarks by saying, "Whatever the photograph, a description of the battlefield, a portrait of a Hollywood celebrity, the turn of collar on the latest fashion, images for a small edition book, or images to sell soap, all of them are equally important." As almost a bookend to this mid-century inquiry into the nature of photography, 25 years later, in April 1976, Wellesley College hosted several photographers in a series of lectures called Photography Within the Humanities. The symposia participants this time included John Morris, Paul Taylor, John Mealy again, Robert Frank, Frederick Wiseman, John Surkowski, Eugene Smith, Susan Sontag, Irving Penn, and Robert Coles. While it is most likely happenstance that Penn followed critic and writer Susan Sontag by 2 days, their presentations managed to bracket a discussion of photography in the humanities. Sontag put photography as a moral practice. In his talk, Penn added that the photograph was a projection of dreams, and the photographer, if good, was both a journalist and a technician. he concluded this presentation was something quite heartfelt. As a photographer, the realism of the real world is almost unbearable to me. There's too much accidental painfulness in it. Now the photographic process for Penn was closer to art as both salve and solution. 30 years before, in the March 1st, 1945 Vogue issue, there was an article titled, "Someone is Always Watching You," an article by Penn with text rather than photographs. It was, according to the magazine's lead-in, about a wounded man, politics, and those civilian hospitals that look like sorcerers' shops. It is a sensitive article by a young man on the front lines, but one who admits that he thinks a good deal about us as artists, and an art of the future that must, he wrote, be in a broad space of human understanding and need. Penn's influence was profound in fashion photography inasmuch as he helped the public realize that it could be art. In the best of his photographs, he has succeeded in imposing his ideal on matter-of-fact reality, an ideal of beauty that has made a whole generation of artists and photographers pause, admire, and imitate his work. But he also influenced the way we think about art. That is, not so much as a rarefied, isolated activity, but one that intersects and influences all aspects of contemporary culture. He came to the conclusion that art, wherever we encounter it, is what makes us human. Our first speaker today is Nancy Hall-Duncan, who has enjoyed a very distinguished career curating and writing about 20th and 21st century art, photography, and importantly for today's discussion, fashion. I have to say that one of the first books that I ever consulted when I arrived at an Irving Penn project was Nancy's History of Fashion Photography, a history that is yet to be duplicated, and I think we all wish that she would update it instantly. I know that you can all read your program, but it is worth noting that Nancy continues to write and practice as a curator, and I'm sure she will have an enormous amount to add to today's discussion. Nancy Hall-Duncan, thank you very much. Help.
Art historians always need technical help.
I'm not the young man.
Is he coming?
Yes, he is.
Okay.
It's not you.
No.
All right, I'll put it up just a second.
There we go. Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here this morning, and I want to thank both Mary Foresta and Betsy Brown for putting together this exceptional opportunity to see Irving's work and for inviting me to speak about it. So we're ready. Okay, good. It's my pleasure to talk about Penn's work today and to introduce you to where his work lay in the history of fashion photography. When I did my book in '79, there was no history of fashion photography, and I had to go back and find out what was happening. But before I get to introducing you to that, briefly to that history, I want to introduce you in a way to Irving Penn. Here he is taking a still life photograph, and you'll notice the famous little liqueur glass in the picture, which is in several of his shots. But I want to, if I can get the cursor to work, yes, I want to let Irving speak about his ideas of photography.
The photographer in our time is someone to whom the whole world is open. He sees the exciting people of the time. He spends his time with them. He sees beautiful women, far places, things that under normal circumstances he would never have occasion to experience. The camera has a meaning. It's a kind of magic symbol today. I suppose it's like the witch doctor's drug. But when you whip out a camera, the entire atmosphere in a room changes. If you tell a prime minister that you would like to photograph him, he becomes a person who is available. He turns the better side. He smiles when he is sour. The world changes character when you whip out your camera. And if the man behind the camera commands the respect and interest of the subject, incredible things take place.
So those were Irving's words in his voice from a seminar that he did at Famous Photographers School. He did several there, and I do want to thank Jeffrey Price, director of the Famous Photographers Archive, for allowing me to take the clips, the audio clips that I'm going to be letting you hear and enjoy today. So Mary Foresta has written that few photographers are as widely beloved and admired as Penn. And I don't think anyone would have any reason not to believe that he was so widely beloved and admired. Here are two pictures of him from the Famous Photographers School. He was a very self-disciplined, self-contained person. And I mention this because I think that the gravity that he had implied his seriousness and the seriousness and importance that he brought to photography. He was quietly reflective and thoughtful in a way that was at the very core of his personality. In the 1964 symposium, he said, "I know that in our studio it's usually done very quietly. We speak in very close to whispers. Little conversation first. The person sits at a small table. I can just see their apprehensiveness falling away." So this lovely quietness and independence of his personality pervaded his work. And it was emphasized by Alexander Lieberman, the editor of Vogue, in a quote. He said, and this was about his trip to Mexico that Mary just told you about, where he went to Mexico to paint. So Lieberman said, "In 1941, I had been in the US less than a year. I was beginning at Vogue when Penn, then art director at Saks Fifth Avenue, replacing the famous Brodovich, called and offered me the job. I remember he wore sneakers and no tie. I was struck by his directness and a curious unworldliness, a clarity of purpose and a freedom of decision. He was dropping a great job to risk the life of an artist. I felt a rapport." And that sums up what Irving brought to this life's endeavor of photography, of which fashion is a part. So to get to what was going on before Penn, there were many amazing photographs. And by the way, fashion photography did not start in 1839 with the beginning of photography. It started around the turn of the century, because in the 19th century, fashion was depicted through illustration, and then eventually through illustration that was hand-colored, then in photographs that were hand-colored and put into the fashion magazines, mainly the fashion magazines in Europe. So it wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century that we get photography being used extensively for fashion. So here we have Cecil Beaton and a Baron de Meyer, this one of 1935, that of 1920. And there were many famous fashion photographers who preceded Penn who produced fabulous pictures. Photographers such as Baron de Meyer, Cecil Beaton, Horst, Erwin Blumenfeld, Man Ray, and many others. And even people like Cortege were doing fashion photographs, many other photographers, but these were some of the prime photographers that were working. Now, one of the aspects of early fashion photography was that there were fairly fussy backgrounds, often. Not always, but very frequently. This one on the left was done by Talbot Studios, a French studio, and Cecil Beaton again, in front of a backdrop that was painted by Pavel Tuchelechev, who was a set designer and worked for the Ballet Russe and other theatrical concerns. So he did this presumably for Beaton. And you can see that in both there is a backdrop that's been hand-painted, carries the meaning of the picture. Now, there were other ways to depict fashion, of course, and one of them was to take the model to unknown places, underwater or on the brink of the Eiffel Tower. And this underwater shot was done by Tony Frizzell and published in Vogue in May 15th, 1941. And the picture on the right is a picture of Lisa Fonsegrives before she became Mrs. Penn and became Lisa Fonsegrives Penn. But there she is up on the Eiffel Tower, dramatic pose, dramatic backdrop, if you will. And I asked her, I knew her well, and I asked her, well, were you worried? Were you scared? And she said, oh, no, in a day's work, you know. She was a very famous model even before meeting Penn, and I'll get to that a little bit later in the lecture. The picture on the left was done at SeaWorld, and it was done through a glass window. I had always wondered how Tony Frizzell got this fabulous shot. And that was the answer, is she wasn't underwater herself. She was taking the shot from a window. But I show it to you because, you know, there are so many different ways of depicting fashion before Penn came along, and so many different characteristics of the photographs. One was dramatic lighting. And John Surkowski, the chairman of the MoMA photography department, said that the magazine, meaning Vogue, the magazine's fashion pictures had been full of elaborate gesture, lit by enough Klieg lights to film Gone with the Wind. And he was absolutely right in this assessment, because the shadow came out of film. And on the left, I show you a picture, still, from a 1927 film, The Cat and the Canary. Juxtaposed to yet another Beaton. But I'll go back to the other one for a moment. You see how Beaton used shadow in a very creative, inventive way. He really took the dramatic lighting of film to a new dimension, because these aren't cast shadows. These are shadows with the model. If it was a cast shadow, it would be a shadow of the model. Instead, she's accompanied by these fabulous sort of dancing, sophisticated dancers behind her, or behind both of them. And then in this one, he has really transformed the shadow to be a second figure. So one shows the costume, sort of, but the shadow shows a different element of things, but very dramatic lighting. Okay, before Penn, there was an extensive use of props. And these are two pictures, wonderful pictures, by Horst and by Durst. Durst was a French fashion photographer. But Horst actually used this same conceit with the picture within the picture, mainly for jewelry. But the picture on the left is a Horst of Frances Farmer, a famous actress of the day, with a pocket watch showing the same image, and it's truly an eye-catching way to incorporate a prop to make a beautiful fashion picture. But the use of props went from these, the sublime, to the ridiculous. These are two Beatons and the Beaton egg hat. And my favorite feature, the egg bracelet that goes along with it, and the use of waste paper baskets as the prop for the fashion photograph. Even Beaton himself conceded that fashion photographers of the 30s had, quote, indulged themselves in a recklessness of style with badly carved cupids from junk shops on 3rd Avenue, enormous paper flowers from Mexico, Chinese lanterns, doilies or cutlet frills, fly whisks, spoons, egg beaters, or stars of all shapes found their way into our hysterical and highly ridiculous pictures. So what else influenced fashion before Penn? And here I'm verging on what Mary has told you. Obviously, Surrealism was in fashion before Penn came along. I had a whole chapter in my book on Surrealism and fantasy, and there was a fabulous show done by Richard Martin at FIT, which has a big catalog, which you can consult on Surrealism and fashion. But Penn was influenced by Surrealism, both with regard to his admiration for Ache's work, but also for that surrealist community in Mexico City, which not only had been a haven for European intellectuals and artists, but which had hosted an international exhibition of surrealist art just a year earlier than Penn's arrival in 1941. So Penn was aware of the type of thing that was going on. These were earlier shots, again, Durst on the left, and unbelievably Steichen on the right, with Marion Morehouse, his signature model, and whoever is pursuing her, in Benda masks. Benda did masks for theatrical productions, was a very famous mask maker. Oh, and here are a couple of other permutations of that idea. Other movements that influenced fashion were other art movements, such as the picture on the right by Louise Dahl Wolff, just placing the model in front of an artwork, in this case, of course, Picasso. And on the left, Man Ray, which is I guess you could call it a variant of his rayograph, but this is fashion coming across the radio waves. And it's not actually fashion coming across the radio waves, but his interpretation of fashion coming across the radio waves. So there were many avant-garde movements influencing fashion in the 30s and 40s. Of course, another major thing that influenced fashion was the war. From the deprivations in fashion, in textiles and materials, to the pervading air that it was unseemly to be too luxurious, which was obviously the correct notion. But this is a Cecil Beaton of fashion taken in front of, obviously, ruins, wartime ruins. So the photographs during the war tended to have a much more frugal and sort of stark appearance than the studio shots that were happening pretty much at the same time. Now we get to Irving Penn. And what I want to do is examine the different elements of what Penn brought to the fashion that I've just, introduced you to. I'm putting the Beaton picture next to the Penn picture. And I think you can see that Penn has stripped all of the excess in his picture down to the bare essentials. Nothing is there that is not an essential to the picture. There aren't fancy props, there aren't fancy backdrops, there aren't fancy lighting. But let's listen to what Penn had to say here. Oop, sorry.
Do the right thing. They would not be casual and unthinking show. If something does not enrich the picture, it shouldn't have been in it.
So that was his feeling about photography in general, I think, particularly in fashion, but in all of his photography. If there wasn't a reason for something being in the picture, it wasn't there, and he stripped it out. It revolutionized fashion. So let's go through the various elements, which I'll be talking about: clarity, backgrounds, space, light, detail, line, and pose, all of which he revolutionized to create a new language. So in terms of clarity, Penn said, the photographic process for me is primarily simplification and elimination. He did this with backgrounds. You can see the Baron, we think this is a Baron de Meyer, and Penn photograph of Lisa Fonsegrive's pen, again done in 1950. And you see the difference in the backgrounds. Penn explained in that Wellesley symposium that Mary just told us about, quote, the Paris paneled drawing room, which was at the time still the ideal background for the photographing of elegant women, was unknown to me. I began to photograph girls in the studio against seamless white paper. Isolating a model against a simple white background was a minor revolution. In exasperation, the magazine's editors more than once said, listen, you've just got to stop doing that. We're fed up with a girl alone in white space. I am surprised now that I had the courage to persist. So, in his own words, he told us what he was doing there. So in terms of space, Penn created his space. One of the earliest ways he did this was to create a corner space, which he said was, quote, a niche to close people in. Some people felt secure in the tight spot. Some felt trapped. It was a kind of truth serum. The way they looked made them quickly available to the camera. And I think you can tell how Georgia O'Keeffe felt on the left. The second way was that he created his space was to open it up a bit and create this backdrop that you see behind the famous mermaid dress. And both were used extensively in his work. Now, in terms of light, Penn's light was very different than the dramatic lighting that I showed you with the shadows. The studio lighting that was so intense and, captured the fashion well, but it was a very different kind of light than Penn was using. So Penn said in 1976, daylight is the most delicious of the several kinds of light available to a photographer. in the introduction to Worlds in a Small Room, he wrote that, quote, "The sweetness and constancy of light that falls from a studio from the north sky, it is a light of such penetrating clarity that even a simple object lying by chance in such a light takes on an inner glow, almost a voluptuousness." And I think you see, the dramatic lighting versus the sort of voluptuous, clear and constant light that he loved on the right. In addition to daylight, Penn used a bank of strobe lights. And if you looked carefully on the first picture that I showed of Penn in the studio doing a still life, you could have seen that bank of lights. But here it is again from a famous photographer's still, because I'll get to famous photographers, but it was a school that basically wanted to teach young people how to take photographs in the manner of the guiding faculty, and of which Penn was one. And so they had this picture of Penn's strobe lights. So in passage, Penn wrote, quote, "It was a colleague, Leslie Gill, who in 1952 first spoke to me of stroboscopic light and its importance in the commercial studio. In spite of my first misgivings, I found myself gradually taken by this form of illumination. It did have useful qualities. Its color balance was predictable and repeatable. Models did not suffer from heat or long poses, and pouring liquids could be frozen in midair." Now, another aspect that Penn revolutionized in his new language was the use of detail as the photograph, not just detail as part of the photograph, but detail as the photograph. Two Irving Penn shots, the Foss shot taken in 1950, and the kerchief glove of Dior, again taken in 1950. Now, showing details of fashion was incredibly important throughout the history of fashion photography. And Louise Dahl-Wolf actually told me that that was her primary concern, was to show the fashion. If a fashion photographer didn't show the fashion, they weren't doing their job. So Penn took it one step further. He wasn't just going to show the fashion with the detail, he was going to show the detail. So he extended out the prevalent idea about fashion, about detail. And this fabulous shot that's in the show shows you another aspect of detail, where he takes not the whole model, but part of the model and makes it the entire picture. Now, not only did he use this idea in fashion, I think he took that idea from fashion and extended it to other parts of his work, such as the nudes that he did and the street photography with the cigarette butts and other objects, the mud glove. All of those are really taking an object that would be part of something else normally and making it the only thing in the picture. Okay, so now we get to line, and Mary did talk about this herself. Penn had an amazingly lively and elegant line to his picture, and this I just show because I like to show the Woman with Roses of Lisa Fonsegrive's pen with the roses, which he did decades later, and I show it in part just because the more you look at Penn, the more you see how things in his early work related and corresponded and influenced his later work. So the Pens is an obvious, the roses is an obvious comparison, if you will. In terms of this actual photograph, John Surkowski wrote in his amazingly wonderful book, Looking at Photographs. He says, "The true subject of this photograph is the sinuous, vernacular, richly subtle line that describes the silhouetted shape." He goes on to say, if you can consider this figure without the head, so just imagine no head, only a modern viewer would be able to identify what remains as representing a woman's body rather than the silhouette of an orchid. So I went looking for an orchid. And I didn't actually find an orchid that corresponded, but I did find an Oriental Poppy that I think really shows you, if you look at the outline of Lisa's dress, with the outline of the Oriental Poppy, and you can see it better just by having both images blackened, you can see that there's an amazing correspondence in the way he used line and the way he brought something new to fashion photography through line. And here are two more examples, two Issey Miyake fashions. Penn developed a strong and close relationship with Japanese designer Issey Miyake, and you can see that Miyake's work was something that must have, I'm assuming, really appealed to Penn because of many aspects, but in part because of this use of Miyake's line, the outline that he uses. And Miyake actually wrote that Penn had showed him new aspects of his own work that he had never seen before looking at Penn's photographs. Now, Penn was not, of course, the only photographer who revolutionized fashion at this exact moment in mid-century. The other great photographer was, of course, Richard Avedon. And I wish I had a lot more time today to talk about the relationship of Penn and Avedon and talk about Avedon's work as well, because they both brought a new language. But I'm just showing you that Penn's use of line was sometimes came into Avedon's work as well. This is a picture of Dovima, fabulous picture of Dovima, where he captures the same type of innovative line, use of line. And here are two pictures just to show you what Avedon, I'm sure all of you know what Avedon was doing, but bringing movement, naturalness, and vitality into the picture with movement. Avedon's mentor and icon was Miyake, a Hungarian photographer who did fashion work in the 30s, placing women running down the beach. And Avedon told me that he just loved those pictures, and that was where he got his inspiration to do movement, to put movement into fashion photography. So this is homage to Miyake, Avedon's work on the left. It's a picture of Carmen, the model who is still walking the runway. Fabulously beautiful woman early in her career, and a picture of Dorian Lee with a bicyclist. And I think you see the vitality and enthusiasm and just sort of naturalness that Avedon was able to achieve. Now back to Penn for the last characteristic that he brought in his new language, which was pose. And again, I'm showing you Penn versus Avedon. And I think you see that sort of quiet elegance in Penn's Harlequin dress. And you see the more dramatic naturalism in Avedon's work with the pose where Sonny Harnett, one of his favorite models in the Made in Paris years, with Kirk Douglas, actually. And this was made in Paris. But I show it to you so that you can see the difference in pose. And if you think back to some of those earlier fashion photographs, they were really dramatic in the use of pose. You know, the models were doing all kinds of things with their arms and bodies. So Penn just made a new type of pose. Now, before I get to this next slide, I want to address that deeply perplexing change in Penn's attitude about magazine work, which he expressed in 1950, and an opposing idea that he expressed 14 years later in 1964. He, of course, was a youngish photographer in 1950 and excited to be involved in magazine work. He said, for the modern photographer, the end product of pictures is the printed page, not the photographic print. But 14 years later, he expressed the exact opposite. He said, a beautiful print is a thing in itself, not just a halfway house on the way to the page. So what caused this amazingly dramatic change in Penn's thinking? And I think it can be explained by the fact that Penn, as he grew as a photographer, wanted respect for his fashion work, wanted respect for the work that appeared in the magazines. He had told, and it's exemplified by a quote that he made to Vin Greco, who was a studio photographer for famous photographers. And Vin Greco told me that Penn had said, today's photo wraps tomorrow's fish. And I think by 1964, Penn had realized, he didn't mean that it literally wrapped tomorrow's fish, but that he didn't think that the reproduction, and I may be wrong, we have experts, much more expert here on the magazine aspects, but I do think that by 64, Penn had come to the idea that he didn't want a temporary or an ephemeral use for his photographs. And that is not to say that he didn't work for fashion magazines for the rest of his life. He did. And he valued that relationship. But he started to want, I think, my opinion, he started to look for other ways to find respect for his fashion work and his other work. And it was in 1964 that Penn began experimenting with reprinting his earlier pictures, many done for the magazines, as platinum palladium prints. Now, also in the 60s, in 1962, Penn joined what was called the Famous Photographers School, along with some of the most famous commercial photographers of his day, including Richard Avedon, Bert Stern, Alfred Eisenstadt, Ezra Stoller, who was Frank Lloyd Wright's photographer, and others. And as one of the guiding faculty of the Famous Photographers School, it afforded him the opportunity to explain and extend his ideas and techniques onto a new generation of photographers. Famous Photographers School was part of an enormously successful group of correspondence schools for artists, writers, illustrators, and cartoonists. And there was a famous photographers, a famous cartoonists, a famous, these other things, illustrators. By 1974, the school had disbanded. So it was a relatively short period of time, but it was incredibly successful, and Penn was a part of this. And I know this because I've been a consultant for the archive, and that's where I gained my knowledge of this. But these are the 10 guiding faculty of the Famous Photographers School. And I think this is one of the lost chapters in the history of photography, because seemingly very few people seem to know of its existence, let alone what had happened there. Now, it's important to remember that fashion photography was the starting point for Penn. Mary Foresta has said that Penn's fashion photographs proved to be his earliest success. And, but even more than as a starting point, it's my contention that the ideas that Penn developed in fashion photography informed developments in several other of his photographic endeavors, and that those endeavors then informed his fashion. So, you know, in other words, there's an inherent continuity in his work where you don't really sort for various genres. It somehow starts to come together as a complete body of work. So we go to Penn's first Vogue cover, October 1st, 1943, and Theater Accident of 1947, which are examples of his still life. Penn said, it would seem that fashion magazines, who is this? Surkowski said that it would seem that fashion magazine still life might have been Penn's invention, perhaps in league with Alexander Lieberman. So let's hear what Penn himself had to say about still life and even more so fashion still life.
Well, I think the important thing to realize is that still life is a representation of people, as far as I'm concerned. Therefore, the people are in the background. They're just, the camera is simply not focused on them. They're focused on evidence of people. So each still life object has got to tell as much of a human story as if you look right into a human being's eyes. Without this, the still life has very little validity in my mind.
Okay. So another famous still life, and these are the lovely little liqueur glasses that you saw in the very first picture of Penn taking the still life photo. He had something to say about this too.
For example, a picture of mine comes to mind that you may have seen of two liqueur glasses and a stubbed out cigarette late at night. The two liqueur glasses tell something of people, even if they are sort of primitive hand-blown glass. There's a smear of lipstick on one and a smear of lipstick on one cigarette. Tells us the man and woman. Tells that their taste is slightly different in liqueurs because one's red, one's green. It tells that it's late at night, there are many cigarettes. Liqueurs tell the time of day since they all come after dinner. You know that they have a certain amount of taste by the simple objects in the picture. They're quite intriguing as people. However, I think you'd be pretty hard pushed to find two real people that you could look at late at night that would be as interesting as the evidence of the two people.
So you should go see the absolutely fabulous large print of this picture down in the show here. It's magnificent. So not only did fashion influence and enrich the still life genre for Penn, but also portraiture. After Penn was working in fashion at Vogue, he was asked to do portraiture, and he said, I began to work in portraiture as a parallel activity to fashion photography. Portraiture for me was a welcome balance to the fashion diet at Vogue, and I was happy to go back and forth from one to the other. So here we have Penn's portrait of the ballet theater group against his picture of the 12 most photographed models. Both were done in 1947. By 1947, Penn had begun doing group portraits, encouraged by the Vogue editor Sally Kirkland, who in the 1940s was the first to stage multiple model fashion shoots. Penn did other group portraits, the New York theatrical producers, the New York cartoonists, and others, but undoubtedly the picture on your right was the most important to him, because it was at this sitting that he met the gorgeous model, Lisa Fons-Greaves, who was to become his wife and his artistic partner in many of the shots that you see both today and in the show. And she is in profile in the exact middle of the picture on the right-hand side. Oh, and here are two pictures just to give you a sense of Lisa Fons-Greaves' pen and Irving Penn. And I love these pictures. They're so intimate and sweet and loving. And my experience was exactly that with them. So I have wonderful, wonderful memories of them. Finally, the other part of Penn's fashion work were the what you might call ethnographic shots. And the picture on the right of the two Guerdas, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, appears in my book in 1979. And it appeared there because Penn wanted it there. He told me that he considered this a fashion shot, and he wanted it in his chapter on fashion photography. And as I was preparing this lecture, I found the 1947 shot that he had taken in Lima, Peru, when probably his first fashion shoot. And this was the picture that he did in Lima as a fashion picture. So you can see that early in his career, he was going toward his later body of work that appeared in Worlds in a Small Room. And I was so excited by this discovery. It seems such a direct link to me that it seems fairly important and certainly very startling and wonderful. So, in conclusion today, I show you The Eye in the Keyhole, a 1953 shot that Penn did. And of course, the use of the eye was in the early shots of the optician's windows. It goes late in his work in the shots of the contact lens with the eye, that very large dramatic picture that many of you probably know. But I chose this picture because I hope I've opened your eyes to some of Irving Penn's fashion pictures. Thank you so much.
I think now we're going to take our lunch break, and I hope this will also give everyone an opportunity to drift into the galleries, which are open, and let you actually see many of the pictures that we've been talking about today. And I hope to see you all this afternoon now that you will have digested a full retrospective of Irving Penn's career. Enjoy lunch, and we'll see you back here at 1 o'clock. Thank you. Oh, so we'll also be signing books in the lobby near the bookstore. Thank you.